Hello, friends. This werewolf is very angry. I'm so afraid. Be sure to subscribe to my channel. When total darkness took hold of the little town and the woods surrounding it, Anna carried the chosen sacrifice through the woods in her human form. The small boy was bundled up in a sheet soaked in blood. She moved through the silent forest with a steady step. She kept her eyes before her. In the distance, she could see the fire. The torches of the ceremony were lit, and they were waiting. The air began to crackle with an electric current that felt like probing fingers. They touched her face and they touched the boy's body. Suddenly, they were all over her, moving her towards the ring of sacrifice with an urgency that was lustful. She felt nauseous and her body ached to transform into a siren, but she held steady. Finally, she was at the edge of the ring. A pile of carnage was carefully arranged at the center of the clearing. All around the forest edge, the eldest of the townspeople stood with torches. At the farthest edge of the clearing from her, Anna saw a wooden cross had been erected. A body hung there. As Anna stepped into the ring with Joseph in her arms, Joseph had a flash of a memory he could not possibly have seen with his own eyes. It tripped into his head with a white-hot pain that made him whimper softly. The electric fingers of the master felt and heard this and were pleased that he had a little life left in him still. He would enjoy ripping the boy apart, ending its fears of what the boy might become. Anna walked towards the pile of dead animals that were stacked in an ornamental design with decapitated pig and goat heads looking out in a neat line at the top. As she drew closer, she saw that the body of the pastor, an elder, and a policeman was propped up against the bottom of the bloody pyramid. The townspeople watched with faces that looked like masks. She wondered if they enjoyed watching this and felt sickened just by looking at them. Sheep, she thought. The electricity left the air and suddenly she could hear the townspeople softly whispering in unison. They were singing what sounded like a prayer, but it sliced the air with a sound like 100 hissing snakes. The leg of the pastor twitched and then stopped. It twitched again and then the other leg followed, and now the dead pastor's eyelids were opening with a wet sound that, unfortunately, her hawk-like ears could pick up in grisly detail. The eyeballs were gone, and the thing looked at her with empty sockets. It gyrated and gurgled to its feet. "Well done, Harpy," the master said through the bloody mouth of the pastor. It clapped its hands like a poorly worked puppet, and the meaty sound of the palms slapping against each other sent a shudder through her body. "Put him down and let me see him," he said with a twitching smile that she knew was meant to show the purposeful irony of his statement. Anna placed the body down and unwrapped the sheets. The boy's body was covered in blood, but he was breathing. The dead pastor approached Joseph with the greedy, grinning face of a hyena. "Stand up, boy. I know you're alive," he said, and the crowd of onlookers hushed, letting their bloody prayers float off into the sky. Joseph blinked and sat up. He stood up slowly, looking around with jerking motions like a trapped kitten. His eyes were huge and filled with panic. He looked around and saw the bloody mess of the pastor limping closer to him. He focused on the thing and tried to put on a brave face, standing defiantly straight with his hands balled into fists. The dead pastor cackled and collapsed. Anna and Joseph looked at each other. From behind the pile of dead animals, something else was moving. It was trying to speak, but Joseph couldn't hear what it was saying. He saw a blackened, smoking hand grasp the face of a decapitated pig and pull itself slowly around the corner. A familiar face peered at him coquettishly from the pile of sacrificed animals. It was Alan. Alan's burned and broken body was looking at him with hungry eyes. It was the only way Joseph could truly tell that it was him. It was the eyes. They had always looked at him that way. He just never realized it until now. Alan's hair was gone, revealing a pink and burning scalp that still sizzled. His body was hunched over and the lower half of his face was completely melted away, revealing a chattering skeleton's mouth that still seemed to grin at him. "Joseph, I love you. I want you. We can be together. Come burn with me," Alan choked out. His throat was ablaze with flames and his words crackled and spat. Joseph's bowels betrayed him, and his courage evacuated his body with his urine. Alan's body laughed and burned and moved towards him with reaching arms. Anna stood back. She kept her head bowed. The master liked to play with its prey. She stared at her feet, letting Joseph decide his fate. If today was his birthday and he truly was what she was, then all he needed was a spark to light the fire of his transformation. She hoped he would find it or they were all doomed. Joseph stepped backward and tripped over the sheet. He cried out as he fell to his back and looked up to see the cross looming over them. He looked at the body hanging there and realized it was his mother. She was crucified, and she was dead. Her clothes had been stripped off and someone had carved the word whore into her torso with a knife. The words screamed out in vivid red blood. The tunnel opened. The wind echoed through the chambers of Joseph's brain and he felt his reality shift. Anger, dull and painful at first, and the sorrow for his lost mother grew inside of him at the sight of her desecrated body. He looked at Alan, the body of the pervert who had preyed on him. He looked at the townspeople, so willing to sacrifice those who don't conform to their way of life. He thought of her eyes, so round and brimming with tears, looking at him over the piece of wooden panel. They were eyes that had avoided his for as long as he could remember. They were filled with shame and despair and love. With that last thought, his anger was so great and his love for her so overwhelming, that he felt himself starting to burn. His eyes rolled up into the back of his head. He imagined Alan's body must be consuming him with its flames as he felt searing pain all over his body. He could smell burning hair and he could feel his skull splitting open. His rage was so complete that he welcomed the pain and breathed the flames into his body. He was growing and changing, and it was agony and ecstasy. He could hear an electric scream faintly echoing in the air all around them. It sounded scared and he was glad. Anna looked up as Joseph was seeing his mother and she stepped forward to shield him from the sight but stopped herself when she saw what was happening. Joseph was transforming into his true being. Flames, as brilliant as the sun, burst out of his eyes and his mouth, and his head looked like it was splitting in two and then three places, pulsing and growing. Alan's body collapsed and the thing inside of it that called itself their master screamed all around them. It was everywhere, but it was afraid. Joseph's body got larger and larger and the flames grew brighter until finally, he was just an orb of blinding light. The light stopped moving for one moment and then exploded outward, knocking over everything in its path. The torches of the townspeople blew out as they fell to the ground. Anna was instantly transformed as soon as the burst of light touched her, and she stood now, as hawk and woman combined into a siren. She looked around the darkened circle, trying to adjust her eyes to the darkness. A shape loomed above them. A deep rumble shook the ground as the shape growled. It looked like it was about the size of an elephant. Anna grinned with needle-point teeth at the ancient being in Joseph's place. Cerberus' three heads looked around, sniffing the air. She saw one of the heads look towards her, and the flames of hell burned in its eyes. An earth-shaking bark shot out of its mouth and the pile of dead animals was set aflame. Anna couldn't see the master anywhere and she wondered if it had escaped. Maybe it would stay away for good, maybe not. The townspeople stayed on the ground too scared to move. A few had fled into the woods back into town, but most sat, eyes transfixed on the enormous beast before them. Anna felt a piercing pain in her side and saw a whitish, ghoul-like hand had sunk its nails deep into her abdomen. She screeched in pain and tried to turn to see what was clinging to her. She bucked and scratched at it, but it sunk its nails deeper. Then it spoke. "Keep fighting and I'll rip your intestines out through your belly button, Harpy." The voice of the demon spoke into her ear. She strained her eye to see what body it had inhabited. It peered out from behind her hair with a face like oozing pus. She knew immediately that this was its true form. It was a white, almost see-through blob of a creature with dripping sores and a fat, sagging belly that dragged on the ground. Its face was eerily human, but with the quality of having been melted like a candle. Its voice was wet and unpleasant, and she could feel what a lowly, greedy creature it was. How it had managed to manipulate a town for centuries, she couldn't understand. But then she looked around at the empty-faced townspeople who were all too eager to see their fellow people tortured and killed. Cerberus turned towards them and all three of its enormous heads growled with a sound like a rolling earthquake. It walked 2 steps towards them. The demon pushed its nails deeper inside of her. She gasped and nearly passed out. She was weakening and starting to turn back to her human form. "Stay away from me, dog. I'm not going back. Come near me and I'll rip her spine right out of her back," it said, eyes bulging out of its gooey flesh. Anna felt her body becoming smaller, more vulnerable and the wound larger and deadlier. She looked at Cerberus and its center head looked directly into her eyes. She passed out and felt herself drifting into that warm ray of light. "You're much more determined than your father was, dog. All I had to do was whisper in his head for a few months and he went mad as a hatter." The demon cackled with its strange blubbery face. Cerberus blinked its many eyes for a moment, taking in his father's demise. "Oh, yes. He walked right off the cliff I led him to. I whispered things that no man should hear, even a half-man like him." Anger ripped through Cerberus again and all three of its heads began bellowing. One blew flames that formed a circle around the demon, Anna and itself. The other howled into the sky until an enormous rock erupted out of the ground and formed a door. It was a steel-colored, stone archway leading into darkness, leading down into hell. The demon looked at the archway and hissed. Bubbles formed on its shuddering lips and popped and dribbled down its chest. Its eyes had gone mad with fear and hatred and it looked at Anna ready to rip at her face in defiance to its dark lord. With a last-ditch effort for escape, the demon threw Anna's lifeless body towards Cerberus and bound on all fours towards the woods. The wall of flames rose up and it was knocked back onto the ground. It seemed to grow smaller and more pathetic as its fate grew closer. Cerberus pinned it to the ground with one paw and watched it struggle. It squealed and hissed and spat at the ground before the guard dog. Cerberus approached the silly little creature with a glint of excitement in all 6 of its eyes. The middle head snapped the thing up and it screeched like a dog whistle. It flipped the demon up into the air and then let it fall back into the jaws of the left head and then up and down into the right, playing with it as a cat does with a mouse. A sound echoed out of the archway and stopped the play on the spot. It was a voice that spoke words no human could decipher, pretty like a lullaby and as paralyzing as ice. Cerberus immediately brought the dangling demon to the archway at the sound of the voice and tossed it in. The screaming of the demon that had brought so much pain to the town, caused so much hatred among these mortal men and women, could be heard all through the night, even after the archway closed on itself and sank back into the earth. Anna awoke to a burning pain in her side. One of the elders, who was a doctor in the town, was stitching her wound up. He managed to do a decent job despite his shaking body. When he finished, he backed off to the edge of the forest and then started to run back to town like the rest of the townspeople. She looked around and saw Joseph kneeling next to the bundled sheet. He was Joseph again, his duty complete. She approached him slowly and stood over him. He had taken his mother down from the cross and wrapped her in the sheet. He was holding her hand and looking at her face. "Do you think they can change?" he said finally without turning around. "Who?" she said, feeling in that moment like her entire life had been a dream. "Our town. The people in our town. Do you think they deserve redemption?" he said. "I don't know," she said, knowing that what she meant was no. "I don't," Joseph said, and pulled the sheet over his mother's face. He stood up and looked at Anna. They looked at each other, their faces much older and wearier than they should have looked at their ages. Joseph picked up a torch from the ground and looked at it. The tip of it suddenly ignited in flames. He looked at his mother's body and lit the sheet on fire. Anna and Joseph watched the flames take Maury away. When the fire died and turned to ash, the two friends set off towards the town, intent on burning it down to ash along with everyone living in it. Somewhere along the way, they transformed and entered the town as messengers from hell. The townspeople screamed and ran like mice when they saw a flying demon lighting their homes on fire and snatching people out of their beds only to drop them down onto the ground to break like things of glass. Those who thought they could escape were surprised and horrified to find that an enormous, three-headed beast was waiting for them on the ground, spewing fire and snapping up family and friends like dog treats. And so, the night was filled with screams until the sun rose and the land was cleansed of the evil that dwelled there for so long. Epilogue. Yes, come right down this way. These streets are all newly paved and I'll tell you, it's really an up-and-coming neighborhood, the sunny, blonde real estate agent chirped. She was showing about 3 houses a day now that the town looked halfway decent. It had taken far too long to get construction underway, especially since no one in the neighboring areas had any interest in a ghost town that had burned down 10 years ago. She wasn't going to tell these potential buyers any of that though. They were from California and they seemed charmed by the idea of small town living. This town is surrounded by forest with beautiful maple, beech, and birch trees, and it is a historic plot of land. The original town was built by English settlers in 1624, the woman said too loudly for such a small group of two. She gestured to the rows of houses on Main Street that had been modeled after the original homes that stood there 10 years before. "Didn't this town burn down?" the young woman asked. She was with her husband and they had been asked to relocate to the area for her nursing job, but the newly built town was an hour away from the hospital. The cost of living was incredibly cheap compared to the neighboring towns and it looked beautiful. It was pristine but quiet. 1 or 2 shop owners had agreed to open temporarily for the summer season, but other than that, most of the storefronts were still for sale. The church, however, had been inhabited for 6 months, maybe more. It stood at the end of the square with some newly planted trees in front of it. The doors were open, and a young pastor stood at the door watching them with a patient smile. He waved when she looked at him and continued to wave even as she looked back at the guide. Well, it's hard to say. There was, unfortunately, no witnesses to the cause of the fire, but because they all died, the young woman's husband interjected. The guide looked stunned for a moment and the young woman felt a moment of pity for her. Still, it was hard to imagine that the guide didn't think the question would come up. Yes, They all died, she said finally, defeated. But rest assured, the construction of the new town has been modernized and such a fire would be nearly impossible to start here. What about the farm on the edge of town? The pig farm? I saw a woman on the porch. She was watching us drive by, the husband said. Ah. Yes, that farm is from the original town layout. It belongs to a lovely young couple who, well, they don't really like to be bothered. In fact, we don't really consider them a part of the new town, especially since they would not agree to sell their land to us. It really is a beautiful rustic town and a wonderful place to raise kids. There's so much space to run and play. The guide was talking faster than she could think at that point. She was hoping to keep a lid on the questions for the rest of the tour and get back home to rip into a bottle of Chardonnay. In truth, she despised the town. It gave her the willies. She couldn't think of one good goddamn reason why someone would want to live in this hellhole. Then again, a whole town of people, generations of them, had lived there for centuries and seemed to have lived idyllic lives until the fire. There were hardly any crimes reported at all.